Hey everybody, I'm George Willett. Welcome back to Family Friday, and we are in our study on Jesus. But tonight we're gonna take a little bit of a different turn. We're gonna take a small break because I've always said if you have a question, then please, put it on one of our social medias, on our videos, email us, call, text, whatever. And we actually had someone who had a question, and I want to. We're serious. We want to help people, so. If you have questions, we want to help. And so today what we're going to do is, here's the question. It actually came from Benita, and it's, can you explain in the book of Mark, chapter 14, verse 51? So I went through and wanted to look at that. And whenever we study the Bible, we always want to keep things in what's called context. It's like we can't just pick like a verse or a couple verses without looking around it to kind of figure out what's going on that helps us to interpret it. So let's read through, and we're going to start at verse 43. Now this whole thing in Mark chapter 14, this is the night that Jesus is betrayed. This is leading up to his crucifixion. He and his apostles, the 12, have had the Last Supper. They have had the Lord's Supper. He has implemented that. He has done this wonderful prayer. If you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you will see in all of these different aspects of what happens that night. But then they leave, and they go to this place called the Garden of Gethsemane and the Mount of Olives. This is a place Jesus knew he would go to and pray. And he went there to pray before his suffering. And this is where Judas, the apostle who betrayed him, comes with the guards. So it says, immediately while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, came up, accompanied by a crowd with swords and clubs, who were from the chief priest and the scribes and the elders. Now he who was betraying him, that means Judas was betraying Jesus, had given them a signal saying, whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him and lead him away under guard. And after coming, Judas immediately went up to him, meaning Jesus, saying, Rabbi, and kissed him. They laid hands on him and seized him. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said, have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as you would against a robber? Every day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But this has taken place to fulfill the scriptures. And they all left him and fled. Okay, so real quick. The high priest, the religious leaders had paid off Judas to betray Jesus. And they do it under cover of night. And Jesus confronts him and says, listen, you could have done this anytime. If what I've done is really against the law, if I'm really guilty of blasphemy, if I'm really guilty of some sort of offense against the Lord, you could have arrested me anytime publicly, but you didn't. And it had to happen this way to take place to fulfill the prophecies about what was going to happen. When this happens and when they go and lay hands on Jesus, there's a scuffle. One of the apostles who we know from other gospels is Peter, takes out a sword and strikes the servant of the high priest's ear off, and Jesus heals him. That's an amazing miracle where he heals the servant. And Jesus is not fighting this. This is what has to happen. He is in control of all of this. But his apostles, the people, these followers that were around him, they scatter. Even though they all promised that they would never leave Jesus, they would never abandon him, that they were all willing to die with him, in this moment of crisis, we see that they all left him and they all fled. Now we get into the part of the scripture that the question comes from. See, in verse 51, we read this. A young man was following him. So there's this young man who's following Jesus. That's the him. Following here doesn't mean that he was just like following along behind him, but he's a disciple. He is part of this larger group. And it says he's wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body. And they seized him, these soldiers, these guards, who were arresting Jesus also went and grabbed onto this young man who isn't named in the text. But the young man, he pulls free, he kind of like twists out, and they hold on to this linen robe, this sleeping sheet, and he pulls right out of it, and he runs away. He escapes naked. And I see I made a mistake on that. That last part should have not been there, sorry. So we're in the Gospel of Mark. So one of the things when you're trying to answer these questions, and I'm going to go through this, I could just give you a quick answer, but we've got to learn how to think biblically, how to read the Scripture, and this is a great opportunity for. So who was Mark, and who was he biblically? Now I'm going to say this: church tradition, early church leaders always attest and say that the Gospel of Mark was written by this young man, Mark, who was a disciple, who was a follower of Jesus. We read about him in the Bible, in Acts particularly. So Acts chapter 12, verse 12. Peter had been arrested and thrown in prison. Again, this is the context. And God sends an angel to free Peter from prison. When Peter gets out, he goes through, he gets out of his chains, he gets out of the prison, walks through the open doors and the unlocked gate, and he's outside, and we pick this up. And when he, meaning Peter, realized this, that he's free, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. So the early church, some of the members of the church, the followers of Jesus, are at this house of a woman named Mary. They're praying because Peter's arrested, and he's supposed to be killed this morning. The next day, he is supposed to be killed, and he gets released. And Peter's like, I know where I am, the house of Mary, this well-known woman who has a house large enough to accommodate a bunch of people there. Peter goes, I'm going to go to Mary's house. And Luke, the writer of Acts, says she is the mother of John, who was also called Mark. So this Mark guy is known. His family is known. The early church knew who he was. But that's not the only time we see him. Because a little bit later in Acts 12 and in verse 25, we read that Barnabas and Saul, they have been in Jerusalem. They have had to do some things. They're ready to go back up to where they were going to do missionary work. And Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their mission, taking along with them John, who was also called Mark. So again, thinking about, all the way to the question from Mark of who is this young man who was there that night and ran out of his own clothing. I want to know who Mark is, who wrote that gospel. So they take John Mark with them, who John Mark is also the cousin of this man Barnabas, one of the early church leaders. They take him on this missionary journey, and they're going all over the place. They travel around, and it's the first missionary journey that Saul goes on. And it's not really successful at first. And John Mark gets, halfway through. He maybe doesn't feel well. He's got some illnesses. He's young. He misses home. He's discouraged that they're not having a lot of success. Whatever the reason is, he leaves and goes back home. He abandons the journey. He abandons the mission journey. And he leaves Barnabas and Saul to do it themselves. So they continue and go on. That's who this young man is. What we realize, one of the other things I need to tell you is later in Acts, Saul, who's also known as Paul, and Barnabas want to go back and visit all the churches they visited on their first missionary journey. And Barnabas is like, let's bring John Mark with us again. He's a good kid. He needs a second chance. He's trying to reestablish him back into ministry. That's a good thing. Saul says, no, he blew it the first time. He abandoned us. We're not taking him again. This is too important. We're not taking people who aren't going to be committed to the mission. And it caused a disagreement. And so Barnabas and John Mark go off and visit Cyprus, where Mark had abandoned them before. Saul, who's also known as Paul, takes a young man, Silas, and they go off to these other churches and visit them again. And you can read all of this in the book of Acts. What's interesting is later in Paul's life, he's writing these letters, like in Colossians chapter 4. He says, and he's writing to the church in Colossae, he says, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, sends you his greetings, and also Barnabas' cousin, Mark, about whom you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. So what we know biblically is John Mark split away from Barnabas and Paul, went off with Barnabas to be restored, and later at some point he reconnected with Paul. They restored that relationship, and Paul, if you read his letters, talks about John Mark a couple of times and says, he's useful for me in ministry. He got restored and relationships were fixed. We also know this scripturally. Peter, who is the head apostle, the apostle that spoke for the group, he writes in his letter, she who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you greetings, and so does my son, Mark. So Peter's writing to the larger church, and he's warning them about some things and encouraging people to, yeah, we're suffering, we're being persecuted, but Jesus is still Lord of all. You know, live the right way, keep your eyes on Jesus, you're going to do fine. And he ends this letter, saying that she who is in Babylon, that's kind of coded language. The church in Rome, chosen together with you, we're all unified, but the church in Rome sends you greetings. And he says, so does my son Mark. You see, Mark not only became a traveling companion and an assistant to Paul, he also began traveling around with Peter and was so close that Peter says he's my spiritual son. He's important to my ministry. He's important to me. He's learning and growing and doing ministry with me. Okay, that's great. We kind of know who John Mark is. Scholars say, and the early church said, that the Gospel of Mark, primarily the source that Mark used as an eyewitness account, was Peter. But he also spent time with Paul. So you've got this young man who is getting all of these stories. And even though Paul didn't follow Jesus when he was on earth, the people that were around Paul were eyewitnesses, like Barnabas. So this is how Mark gets all of the information that he writes down. Now, what does that have to do with Mark 14? A young man was following him wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body, and they seized him. But he pulled free of the linen sheet and escaped naked. Here's what most scholars say. This is the only gospel of all four gospels that talk that there was a young man there that night along with the apostles. Most scholars, a lot of scholars will say this. We don't know for sure, the gospels don't say. But this young man was John Mark. And that he may have actually been in Jerusalem in the house where the Last Supper was. They were in the upper room. Well, we know that his family had a large house where people could gather, so could it be possible? It could be possible. But he wanted to tell part of the story that he was an eyewitness to, that he knew about, and give this personal feel to it, and say, okay, I know all this happened, I was there. There was a young man who followed after Jesus wearing nothing but the linen sheet. And when they seized him, he pulled out and he ran naked. So why doesn't he say this was me, John Mark? That's not the way ancient writers did their biographies. That's not the way they wrote about people and put themselves in it. It's why they didn't write their names, the Gospel of Mark by John Mark. This is just the way ancient writings were. Now, can we say without a doubt that that man is John Mark? No, because Scripture doesn't say without a doubt. But again, scholars, for some pretty good reasons, have interpreted all of this together, say that the writer of the Gospel of Mark, John Mark, is this young man who was following after Jesus and who ended up escaping from the guards and running away naked from Jesus. So, that was a long, long way to get to an answer of who we think it probably was. But I enjoyed the question because, again, I think a lot of people, when we're reading Scripture and we just give you the easy answer, oh, it was probably John Mark. That's great, and people get an answer, but they don't know why we got the answer. So they then just have to say, oh, I'm going to take it on faith that George knows the answer to this question. I don't want people to depend on me. I want to say, here's how we can get into Scripture. Here's how we can get into the study and say, here's what kind of makes sense. Here's what we do know. And can we infer anything from what we know? And again, there are answers we get that we're like, this is a possibility. But if Scripture doesn't say it specifically, someone doesn't agree with me, I'm fine with that because I could be wrong here. Some of the scholars who believe this could be wrong. And ultimately, this answer doesn't affect our salvation because our salvation depends upon Jesus, who he is, what he has done for us, and whether we have truly surrendered our lives biblically to him. But the other stuff is just fun to get into the Bible and study it. So I hope this was helpful to you in some way, thinking how we can work through the Bible, we can think biblically, and maybe we can come up with some answers if we just put some work into it. And if it wasn't super helpful with you, I'm sorry, but it was fun for me. So God bless, and we'll see you next week.